One.
Hola, amigos! No, don't worry, we're not actually going to learn any Spanish this lesson. Actually, today we're going to look at the section in the Gordon West Manual on interference. Interference on ham radio. So to start off, what do I mean by interference? What is ham radio interference? Well, ham radio signals often interfere with each other, with other things. Sometimes they interfere with each other, like as you're transmitting, your signal might interfere with someone else's signal on the ham radio airways. But other times, ham radio signals actually interfere with something else. You see, ham radio signals have been known to cause many appliances to act strangely whenever you transmit. Let me give a few examples. You might have a garage door, an automatic garage door at your house where you press a button and yet the garage door opener opens the garage. Garage door openers do not like ham radio signals sometimes. In fact, some hams garage doors, they actually will open and close as they're transmitting because the signal interferes with the garage door openers and makes the garage door openers think that they're being commanded to open and close even though they aren't. It's just the ham radio signal. Nevertheless, the ham radio signal causes their garage doors to open and close as these hams are transmitting. And it's the same thing with touch lamps. Now, you might have heard or you might have or own a touch lamp, which is a lamp, it goes vertically up like this, and instead of having a physical switch to turn it on and off, you kind of tap it on the side, and that triggers it to turn on and off. Well, touch lamps don't like ham radio either. The sensor that detects whether you're touching it, it thinks whenever you transmit a ham radio signal, the ham radio tricks that sensor into being think that the lamp is being touched, when it's really just a ham radio operator transmitting nearby. As a result, when you transmit on ham radio, these touch lamps often turn themselves on and off just randomly. And the same thing happens with touch sinks. So you might remember a few years ago, there was a lot of television ads for the Delta Touch faucet. It's a faucet you put in your kitchen, and instead of having a faucet knob, you just touch it to turn it on and off. So I once talked to someone on ham radio who actually owned one of these Delta Touch faucets. And what he was telling me is that his faucet in his kitchen actually turned itself on and off repeatedly whenever he transmitted, which is really a big problem. In fact, when our conversation ended, he literally said that the reason he had to go was, quote, because my wife has to do the dishes now, end quote, because the ham radio was triggering his faucet to turn on and off. I've also heard of doorbells that start ringing whenever ham radio operators transmit. Now, in my home, personally, my doorbell is fine. We don't have a garage or anything. I don't really have a problem with interference, at least not a serious one. But in my home, transmitting on ham radio does make my computer speakers downstairs buzz, and you can actually hear a faint trace of my signal, even though the speakers aren't plugged into the radio station. And I can also only use certain keyboard and mice in my ham radio station hooked up to my computer. There are certain certain keyboards and certain mice that I have where when I plug them into my computer and start transmitting, these keyboards stop working because the RF, the radio signal from my antenna, actually goes into the keyboard and into the keyboard's wire that connects it to the computer, and it interferes with everything, and the keyboard freezes up and stops working while I'm transmitting. Which is especially a problem when you're doing digital modes where you have to be typing on the computer as you're transmitting. So anyway, that's interference, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get started. So some of the topics in this section, they aren't actually exactly interference related, but they are grouped in this section on the Gordon West Manual, so we're just going to look at them as we explore interference. So the first thing you need to know is when your audio on ham radio gets distorted or unintelligible, like something's definitely wrong. Now there are a number of things that might be causing distorted or unintelligible audio. Number one, your transmitter might be off frequency a little bit. Number two, your batteries might be low if you're using some sort of portable ham radio or a mobile one or a handheld radio. Third, you could just be in a bad location and maybe you need to move a little and then your signal will get better and the distortion will go away. Any of these situations are possible and they would all cause distorted and unintelligible audio. In fact, there are so many different possibilities that may cause this sort of bad audio. There are so many different possibilities that whenever the test on ham radio asks you a question about distorted or unintelligible audio, all of the choices in that question will be correct. All of them will be correct because there are so many different ways that this can happen. So something that can cause interference on ham radio on the actual airwaves, so we're not talking about interfering with appliances, but interfering with other stations on ham radio. Something that can cause interference, especially on FM, is when your microphone gain is set too high. Now when we say microphone gain, we basically mean microphone volume. The word gain and the word volume in ham radio basically mean the same thing. So when your microphone gain or your microphone volume is set too high, what happens is that your outputted transmitted signal, it might become distorted. That is if your microphone volume is too high. So this often happens when you talk too close to a microphone. Because obviously when you talk too close to a microphone, you're talking very loudly. It sounds very loud to that microphone, and this can cause this distortion. Talking too close to a microphone causes what we call over-deviating on FM. So allow me to demonstrate. This is the microphone that I'm using to record all of my video lectures. And I clip it onto my shirt, so you've never probably seen it. But this is the microphone I use to record. So if I put it close to my face, I'm still speaking at the same volume, but the volume will obviously get louder. And you can probably also hear how the volume is becoming, my audio is a little distorted. But when I take the microphone away from my face, the volume does get quieter, but it gets very much less distorted, much better, right? So this phenomenon can cause FM signals to interfere with people on nearby frequencies because they over-deviate. Give me 1 second to put my mic back onto my shirt. All right, so this phenomenon causes FM signals to over-deviate. So remember, FM, the way it transmits signals is that FM signals, they sort of deviate. They go away from the middle carrier frequency based on the loudness of the frequency. So if, in other words, if this is the carrier frequency, the other parts of the FM signal will sort of wiggle around, deviate from this frequency. That's how they transmit information. But remember we said if you talk too loud into the microphone, the louder you talk, the more it will deviate away. Maybe not that much, but you can see what I mean. So think about it. The more the FM signal is deviating away from its original frequency, that means it's going to go into a different frequency. It's going to sort of overlap into an adjacent frequency, maybe an adjacent frequency that someone else is using. And in that way, talking too loud into your microphone can cause over-deviation. And say there's another FM signal right over here, and you're supposed to just be going like that, not interfering with it. But if you talk too loud, you kind of, you mess up the other person's signal, and that causes interference. And that's obviously not a good thing. So that's it for FM deviation and over-deviation and interference that way. Now let's talk about something else, which is interference in your car. And if you're a high school student, I don't know, you might not have a car, but actually you can operate ham radio in your car. In fact, a lot of people do this, and they call this mobile operations. And they have a mobile radio that just sits in their car and an antenna on their car's roof, and they operate in their car. But because of how complicated cars are, if you consider, they have an engine and they transmit power using an alternator or generator and everything like that, things get a little bit complicated when you're trying to operate ham radio in a car. I won't go into all the details. For now, let's just focus on how the car causes interference. Your car will actually cause interference to your ham radio. So you see, every car has an alternator, and the alternator is hooked up to the engine, and as the engine spins, it turns the alternator, and the alternator creates electricity, which can then use usually to power everything in the car. Now, the alternator in cars causes a high-pitched whine on your ham radio that varies with engine speed. So in other words, as you press down the gas pedal, the engine speed goes up. This high-pitched whine might change pitch. And if you take your foot off the gas pedal, it might change back to normal. But there's always this high-pitched whine that you can hear over your ham radio when you're receiving signals. And this is because the car is sort of generating interference on radio signals that's being picked up by your ham radio. Now, usually, if you're lucky, this whine will only be heard by you as you're receiving signals. Sometimes this whine is heard by people you're talking to. And if this happens, if people who you're talking to who aren't in a vehicle are hearing this high-pitched whine coming from your signal, that means that the noise of the vehicle's electric system, the noise from the alternator, is being transmitted along with the sound of your voice. So now you're interfering with other people because of your car. Your car's messing things up. So radios have what we call, luckily, a noise blanker feature. And the noise blanker can, when you turn it on, can fix this interference problem. A noise blanker detects the interference that you're receiving, and it blanks out this unwanted noise, hence the noise blanker. The noise being, the interference noise, the high-pitched whine that you don't want. So noise blanker is very handy for reducing interference caused by cars. And it can be used to reduce some other interference as well. Not all interference, but certain types of interference, it can be very effective. So let's go back to something I said at the beginning of this lecture. You remember how I said that my keyboard and mouse, they sort of got messed up whenever I transmitted on my radio, and my speaker sort of got a buzz. And this is because when I transmitted, the signals emanating from my antenna, some of those signals, the radio waves went into my keyboard, into my mouse, into my speakers, and more specifically, they went into the cables that run from my keyboard to my computer. The radio signals got into these cables and messed up all the signals that my keyboard was trying to send to my computer. And that's why my keyboard didn't work. But to solve this, what we do is we can put on something that I brought along here. And second, this thing. So what we do is we put this thing, we attach it onto the cable, and this is called a ferrite choke. Now you see these often attached to cables on monitors, cables, and USB cables. And I bet you always wondered what they're for. If you want, you can look at maybe at the back of your computer if you're using a desktop, or pull out some sort of cable. I bet you can see this, or maybe a smaller version like this. You'll see this somewhere attached to your cable, and you've got to wonder, what is that for? Why did they put that there? Well, now you sort of know. This is called a ferrite choke. These are ferrite chokes. What is a ferrite choke? Well, a ferrite choke, basically, it chokes the RF signals out of the cable, making these peripherals usable in your ham radio shack. So when you attach these to a cable, it can keep all the ham radio signals, all the radio signals out. So you see it opens up, you lay the cable in here, you close it on the cable, and somehow it removes the RF from the cable. And it's very handy. I use these a lot in my ham radio shack, and it saved me from having to throw out a bunch of cables and get new ones. This is handy for microphone cables too, because actually, as you're talking into your ham radio microphone, radio signals that you're transmitting can get into your microphone cable and mess up all your audio that you're trying to transmit. Obviously, that's a problem. So what you can do is you can buy these ferrite chokes, snap them onto your cables, and a lot of times that will completely remove the interference. So I ordered these on Amazon. They came in a big bag, a big pack. So I actually ordered them from China. And it's actually a funny thing. When I ordered them, I remember they had the ferrite chokes in the bag, and there was also a hair in the package along with the ferrite chokes, which was a little bit weird and a little bit creepy. But anyway, these ferrite chokes, they work just fine. You can order them on Amazon for pretty cheap. So very handy to have in your ham radio station. Finally, cable TV and ham radio. Cable TV and ham radio don't always mix well together. In fact, oftentimes your ham radio might cause interference to your cable TV. Now, your cable TV, it isn't hooked up to an antenna or anything. It's not using radio signals that way. I mean, it's cable TV. But actually, the cable that connects your cable TV to the cable company and gives you video, there are actually something resembling radio signals in that cable. So your ham radio can actually interfere with your cable TV, get inside your cable TV and mess up all the signals that your cable TV is receiving. So if this happens, if your ham radio causes your cable TV interference, what you need to do first, your first step, is to make sure that all of your coax is installed properly. So coax is a name for the cable that runs from your radio to the antenna in your ham radio station. It's the antenna cable, basically. And cable TV actually uses coax too, except in a different way. Instead of running from your cable box to an antenna, it actually runs from your cable box to your cable company, wherever that is. It goes somewhere underground. But anyway, it's actually the same type of cable carrying similar types of signals. So what you need to do is make sure that the coax on the cable TV is installed properly, and the coax in your ham radio station. Make sure everything is nice and tight. In other words, make sure the antenna cables are plugged in tight on everything, because loose coax connectors can actually cause interference, because the signals will sort of, I guess they will escape out of the loose connections and they'll go everywhere, and that's what causes interference. So I wrote that down on the board. Actually, I wrote a few things down on the board to help you remember. Microphone gain or volume, when that's too high, that's bad, to put it simply. Car alternators cause the high-pitched whine. And the ferrite choke chokes RF out of the cable. And finally, make sure the antenna and coax cables are plugged in tight. And that leaves one more thing on the board, really, that we have to go over: filters. So what is a filter? Well, in ham radio, we have what we call harmonic emissions that are coming from your station. Now, harmonic emissions, that's basically another form of interference. It's interference from your station or other signals that your station is transmitting that we don't want. Now, if your station is emitting harmonic emissions or these kind of interference signals we don't want, what you can do is you can install a filter between the transmitter and the antenna. And this filter will filter out these harmonic emissions, and that will remove the interference. Now, the filter has to go between the transmitter and the antenna, so that this way the harmonic emissions that are being transmitted by your radio, they're cut off, they're filtered out before the signal reaches and is broadcasted by the antenna. Obviously, you can see why that'd be needed, because it needs to be stopped before it gets to the antenna, but after it gets through the transmitter. So these filters actually aren't needed much anymore, but there are still test questions about it. So you do need to know that filters go between the transmitter and antenna to reduce interference, or what we call harmonic emissions. Okay, so this section in the Gordon West Manual has 20 questions in it. Let's take a break right now. We'll stop right here. So you can take a little while to process this, study it in the Gordon West Manual if you'd like. And after that, you can move on to video lecture number 2, and we'll cover the last section on interference. See you then.